Is Russia committing war crimes in Ukraine? How is Britain attempting to ramp up pressure on Putin? And how big could Ukraine's refugee crisis get? This is what you need to know. Hello, I'm ITV News presenter Nina Hossain. Welcome to our latest podcast, trying to bring you up to speed on all the key developments on the Ukraine invasion and where it could go next. In this episode, we'll hear from our Europe editor, James Mates, who remains in the Ukrainian capital and central Russian target, Kyiv, from our correspondent Lucy Watson, who is in Poland reporting on the mass exodus of refugees, and from our political correspondent Daniel Hewitt in Westminster on the diplomatic efforts to target Russia. We'll start then with claims of war crimes that are emerging against Russia in Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says civilians were deliberately targeted in the massive bombardment of the second largest city, Kharkiv. Our correspondent Dan Rivers has filed a report amid the debris of the city's Freedom Square after the missile attack. You can see Dan's report on the ITV News website. Let's get reaction then straight away from James Mates on this. Look, President Zelensky has told the European Parliament that Russia has committed state terrorism. This is a war crime, that Russia is deliberately targeting civilians, including children. What evidence is emerging that what he is saying is correct?
Oh, look, these are very, very early days. What we're working on is little clips of video normally being shot on people's phones. I really don't want to get into too many specifics about exactly which crimes may have been committed and where, except to say that obviously deliberately targeting civilian areas is a war crime. And the video evidence we have of the attack on Freedom Square in Kharkiv, and perhaps actually more damning still, is what appears to be a Grad rocket, you know, those multi-launch rocket systems, or even cluster munitions exploding in Kharkiv in what are clearly civilian areas. Now, where this goes with war crimes, I mean, obviously it's completely horrific, not playing it down at all, but these tend to be things that you work out after the war is over. This is what happened in Bosnia. You did end up with a lot of people, not just Serbs, but Croat generals as well, ending up at The Hague, often being given long sentences for what they had ordered. But that was after evidence had been collected and after the war was over. The very knowledge that this has happened before and that there is no impunity or immunity just because you're acting on your government's orders may well be a significant thought in the minds of the generals or officers who are ordering this. But recording it happening, gathering the evidence, having the evidence will be vital after this war is over. But as of right now, I don't think it's going to be a massive game changer in terms of what's happening.
James, we've seen Boris Johnson in Poland this morning. He said many things, one of which he said that Putin had fatally underestimated the Ukrainians. From what you've seen, how is the Russian military response doing? We've obviously covered a lot about what's happened in that second largest city, but what about elsewhere?
Clearly the Russians had massively underestimated the Ukrainians' ability and willingness to resist, and overestimated the capabilities of their own armed forces. They thought they could do this quickly, surgically. There is some significant evidence that they anticipated this whole thing would be over in 4 days and that they'd have a puppet regime installed in Kyiv by then. And now here we are on day 6 and they still haven't taken a single major city. So, I mean, something went very badly wrong in their planning. The really worrying thing, though, now is that if they move away from the surgical strike against Kyiv, against Kharkiv, against these incursions which they thought would decapitate the regime, and now we end up in a grinding war of attrition in which they do fight their way through civilian areas, in which they do use the tactics that they used in Grozny in the 90s and again in Aleppo, in Syria more recently, of wide scale and widespread artillery and rocket attacks on civilian areas, and try and achieve their victory that way.
What do you think is the possibility of peace talks resuming that have any chance of bringing an end to any of this carnage that you are witnessing there? We know they ended yesterday. We know they ended with both sides saying they would agree to talk again. What are the chances of that being successful?
Well, I mean, the talks, as you say, they broke up, but they didn't break down. There was no walkout. There was no storming away from the table saying there's no basis on which to talk. It doesn't seem that they did find much of a basis on which they could talk, but at least when they left, they said that they were going to go back to their governments and consult and try and get back around the table again soon. So that really is the only glimmer of optimism we have to hang on to. President Putin yesterday said that, unconditionally his demands had to be met in terms of Russian security guarantees and in terms of demilitarizing and this awful word he uses, denazifying Ukraine. So it didn't look like there was much compromise coming there. But the key thing here is, does Russia want to end this war, or does it want to fight out an appalling, grinding battle, which may well end in victory at the end, and with Ukrainian ruins and I mean, the spoils of victory would be devastating for both, obviously, Ukraine, but also for Russia. Has Russia decided, when Russia decides that it doesn't wish to prosecute the sort of war it's now going to have to fight, there may be a chance of peace. But until that moment comes, it's quite hard to see what possible common ground there is, and it's also quite hard to see what sort of off-ramp, what sort of exit route could be provided for the Russians to allow them to claim victory and walk away, if that's what it took.
I'll come back to you on that a little later. I just want to head to Poland now from Ukraine and join Lucy, who we've seen is at one of those refugee camps where Ukrainians have fled the shelling, have fled what is happening in their country to seek shelter and warmth and food in Poland. Lucy, the people that you've spoken to, and there are many, what are their plans? Are they just glad to be in Poland, having reached that safety, or are they using that as a place to go on to another country from there?
Well, Nina, the 500,000 people who have fled Ukraine so far, 400,000 of them have come to Poland, well, almost 400,000. Now, many of them are arriving by train, and quite often some of the train stations are almost acting like a pit stop. They can stop there for food, water, and then go on to elsewhere in Poland. Large cities like Warsaw and Krakow, these already have large Ukrainian communities living there. About 1 million Ukrainians already live in this country and are working here. So there are large communities already established. That would seem to a refugee the natural place to go for them. But then there were also people at these train stations over the past few days with signs offering transportation, offering lifts to people to go to the likes of the Czech Republic or to Berlin in Germany. And we spoke to one man who had decided at midnight on Saturday that he couldn't watch the images on the television any longer back home in Germany, and he drove all the way here to this town called Przemyśl, which is very close to the border, has a very large train station, which is almost like the first port of call after you cross over at the border points. And he'd come here, and he didn't want to be inactive, so he drove all the way here. So people are dispersing all over Poland and all over Europe eventually. But right here is the immediate need, the immediate aid, this huge distribution centre, which is quite an extraordinary image and picture of just how, well, civic solidarity has mobilised in Poland.
It's really a fantastic effort that you have witnessed, and a really organised one as well. It must be such a relief to people who arrive there. But what happens now is that some of that aid needs to go back the other way to Ukraine for the people who have stayed either by choice or because they couldn't get out.
Exactly, Nina. I mean, only in the last hour, in fact, where we were standing, so right behind me now, you can probably, I explained earlier that there are piles and piles of, buggies, and there are car seats, shoes, food, drink, all that kind of thing that people might need, or they fled home without, they fled Ukraine without. But also kind of on the other side of the field, if you like, was a lorry. And what we're so used to seeing on this side in Poland is aid being offloaded to lorries, into train stations, into big piles, this is a supermarket car park effectively, into places like this. And what we were seeing was a human conveyor belt taking aid off the floor in this field, water, food and drink again, and going into the lorry, because that lorry, the organisers told me, is doing just that, Nina. It is heading into Ukraine and destined for the capital, Kyiv, because the situation there, obviously, as everybody has seen, is so dire that things like food and drink will start to run short. So the aid has been so overwhelming here that they are aware that that aid needs to go in the opposite direction now. And I suppose the immediate need, the most desperate need for Ukrainians is also just the other side of the border, because for days they are having to wait. I mean, the border that runs along Poland and Ukraine is 300 miles long, and I think there are about 9 different crossing points. And at each one of those crossing points, there are thousands and thousands of people wanting to come across, and they're being let over in like numbers of 50. So it's quite kind of measured, if you like. There isn't that kind of mass crush to get over, a mass scramble. But on the other side, it is intense. There is no water, there is no food, there are freezing temperatures. And in the last couple of hours, the Polish government has become acutely aware of that, and is now sending supplies to that point as well, even tents, because of course in this cold, I mean, it's been below zero every single night that we've been here. It is freezing, and standing in line, walking for hours and hours and hours in that cold, they need shelter, they need blankets, and that is what is now starting to filter over onto the immediate other side.
Lucy, I'll end with you with an impossible question, but I have to pose it anyway. How big do you think the refugee crisis could get?
Well, Nina, before this conflict began, before the invasion started last week, the UN predicted that around they were warning, the UN was being warned that around 5 million people from Ukraine could be displaced, and it seems that is getting increasingly likely, Nina.
Lucy Watson, thank you very much. Let's pick up on the refugee crisis with Daniel in Westminster. Look, if you think about the UK's response in comparison to the EU, there's been a lot of criticism of what Boris Johnson and the government is offering. Just bring us up to speed in how many people this government, the UK government, is offering to help, and who they are right now, because it's different to the EU's response, isn't it?
It is, Nina, and it's probably worth laying out the EU's response and the UK's response so you can see the difference. So the EU scheme, EU27, are saying that anyone fleeing the war in Ukraine, any Ukrainian refugee, can settle in any of the 27 countries of the European Union, visa-free for 3 years. The UK government's response has been more targeted, and it's around family, so people already settled here in the UK, so Ukrainians already with family here in the UK. Now, the position yesterday, as laid out by the Home Secretary Priti Patel, was that the scheme would apply to people who had a spouse here, an unmarried partner who'd been together for 2 years, or a child under 18, or adult relatives who are also carers. So quite a small group of people, which the UK government estimated would be around 100,000 Ukrainians eligible for that scheme. We've already seen that scheme come under pressure and now soften in terms of the eligibility. So Boris Johnson landed in Poland, and one of the first things he said after speaking to our colleague Ragi Omar was that number would be doubled to at least 200,000. And that's because we've had confirmation now from Downing Street that scheme, the eligibility for that scheme, will be extended. So will now include adult parents, grandparents, children over 18 and siblings who are already settled here in Britain. what is unclear is how the UK government has come to that figure. I mean, there has to be an estimation, and it's a pretty hard number to come to. I mean, it's assuming the UK government know exactly how many Ukrainians live here, exactly how many family members they have. So it could be a lot more than 200,000, and Boris Johnson kind of kept the door open today for that figure to be more than 200,000. But I think the government is going to come under increasing pressure, not just from Labour, not just from the Refugee Council, who've called this scheme mean-spirited, but also from their own side. I mean, Conservative MPs have said they just want to see the government do a lot more here. So I think this one is one that's going to stick around. I can see that number increasing. I mean, the government's position is, and it's probably fair point, that the majority of Ukrainians will want to stay in Central and Eastern Europe, much closer to their country. There's also obviously security implications. But the fact that if you look at most Ukrainians, their first foreign language is English, and there'll be lots of people who want to come here with family members here. I think that position may have to move, I think, Nina.
Yeah, we'll see how that unfolds. I was hoping to go back to speak to James Mates, but there's been a air raid siren going off. The practical nature of trying to talk to our correspondents who are in the middle of a war zone right now. So, Daniel, if I can just come to you and ask you the same question, really. We've had this building international response in terms of economic sanctions from the US, from the UK, from the EU, from the likes of independent nations like Switzerland. Is there any sense that any of this thus far, will change President Putin's mind about what he's started?
It's a really difficult question. On the face of it, the answer is no, because the response to unprecedented sanctions, incredibly severe economic sanctions, the Kremlin's response has been to double down. I mean, militarily, they're sending more troops in. Their behaviour, as James and our fantastic team of correspondents have been reporting, has become more aggressive. That said, they are unprecedented economic sanctions. They're only just starting to bite. And unlike other sanctions, it's worth mentioning here that since 2014, the Russian economy has effectively been sanction-proofing itself as much as it can since what happened in Crimea. It's prepared for sanctions. It would have gone into this invasion knowing that sanctions were coming. But as you mentioned, with Switzerland and our others, the sanctions have come from countries that aren't normally involved in this kind of response, aren't normally dishing out these kind of punishments. And we are starting to see in Russia the effect on the Russian people. Unlike other sanctions imposed after Crimea, these sanctions will hit Russian citizens. We've seen queues start to form ATM machines. We've already now seen the Russian economy, the ruble, collapse. The stock market closed early yesterday. Interest rates have gone up. Also worth remembering, though, Nina, that sanctions are a two-way street, and these sanctions will bite the West as well, and we've started to see that. I think it's worth mentioning that it's not just economic sanctions that the West is trying to impose here, and we've heard Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, is in Geneva today talking at the UN, and we've heard reports that the UK will be looking to push for Russia to be suspended as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. I can tell you that a source close to Liz Truss has confirmed to me that is something they are looking into, but they are really downplaying how effective that would be. I mean, it's never been done before. How you would remove Russia as a permanent member, and the key word here is permanent member of the UN Security Council, given it's got a veto, is pretty difficult, if not impossible, to see. But I think what we're starting to see is the UK come up with more inventive, more creative ways of trying to impose sanctions, not just in terms of economics, but also in terms of diplomacy.
We'll have to see and wait to see what happens next on that and the rest of the response from the West and beyond. Daniel Hewitt, thank you. Thank you to James and Lucy as well. You can listen to our previous podcast for more from our experts on Russia's aims for the invasion and efforts to stop Putin. And of course, head to the ITV News website for more analysis on the very latest on the crisis. Until next time, thank you